Okay. Welcome to NANP's monthly educational webinar series. I am your host, Andrea Granson, Education Specialist for the NANP. Today's topic is Nutritional Approaches to Strong Bones with John Newstat, ND. These webinars are recorded and can be viewed at any time by logging into the NANP members area where you can earn 1 continuing education credit. Okay, so let's get started. John Newstat, NC, is the founder and president of Nutritional Biochemistry Inc., a company providing patients with optimal doses of nutrients supported by clinical research. He is also the founder of NBI Pharmaceuticals with over a dozen US FDA orphan drug designations for natural products' potential treatment of rare diseases. Dr. Newstat hosts the Delivering Health podcast and is vice president of the California Naturopathic Doctors Association. He chaired the medical committee for the 2020 San Diego JCC Maccabee Games, a youth supporting event with athletes from the United States and over 70 delegations worldwide. Dr. Newstat is a prolific author and recognized by Elsevier, a top 10 cited author. He frequently speaks at medical conferences about dietary supplements, natural products, and osteoporosis. Welcome, John. We are pleased to have you here. It's now over to you.
Thank you. I'm excited to be able to share what I am so passionate about in terms of helping people understand how they can help their clients and patients and themselves to maintain bone strength, improve bone health, and reduce their risk for fractures. And before I launch into the heart of my presentation, I think it's relevant to give a little bit of background because we all have backstories of how I came to specialize in this condition. I never saw myself doing this when I was in medical school or even really early on in my clinical practice. But what happened is my mother-in-law was diagnosed with osteoporosis. She was working with her conventionally trained physician. She was taking a Fosamax. Her bone density was going up, so she was happy. Her doctor was happy. I was happy because that's the best I knew at the time. And then she fell and broke her hip. And I thought to myself, wait a minute. There's something wrong with this picture. And I started looking at the research and discovered that the near complete focus, the limited focus on looking just at bone density and tracking that number on the test is leaving patients woefully unprotected, because the most dangerous thing with osteoporosis, and I'm going to get into the details of this momentarily, is breaking a bone. So the entire emphasis should be about reducing someone's fracture risk. And with that, I will start launching into some of my slides. So this is a little bit of the companies I'm involved with, the organizations I'm involved with, just so everybody knows. There are citations all throughout the presentation. Please feel free to go and do your own research as well. I'm happy to send PDFs of any of the citations to people who reach out to me. My email is on the opening slide there. You can get in touch with me at Dr. Newstat and mbihealth.com. But with respect to my volunteer work and some of the exterior work I'm doing outside of my company, I am on the corporate advisory roundtable for the Bone Health and Osteoporosis Foundation. So that's relevant to this talk. My book, Fracture Proof Your Bones, a comprehensive guide to osteoporosis, was released last year, has had some wonderful reviews. I'm very proud of the information in there that I'm bringing. It helps people create their holistic action plan and walks them through chapter to chapter how to have conversations with their doctors, what questions to ask, how they can better and protect their bones, improve their bone health, and reduce fracture risk holistically. So what's the real risk? The real risk with osteoporosis is breaking a bone. It is so common. It is such a prevalent disease that every 30 seconds somewhere, someone in the world breaks a bone because of osteoporosis. And if you break a bone, with osteoporosis, if you break a hip, there's up to a 36% chance that you're going to be dead within a year. And for those folks who survive, about half of them never regain their pre-fracture level of mobility, independence, and pain-free lifestyle that they had. Now, the median age of a hip fracture is about 82 years old, and the median age for vertebral fracture in women is in their 70s. So obviously, this is a condition, this is a situation that is more common as people get older, and the risk for fractures increases as people get older as well. The lifetime risk for fracture is about 40%, which is about the same for cardiovascular disease. In fact, globally, osteoporosis is second only to cardiovascular disease as a public health challenge. For women 45 years or older than 45, it accounts for more days spent in the hospital than other diseases like diabetes, heart disease, breast cancer. And that's something that most people don't realize. I love this slide because it really drives home how serious and common an issue this is. In fact, a woman's risk of an osteoporosis fracture is equal to her combined risk of breast, uterine, and ovarian cancer. But in fact, there's no osteoporosis awareness month like there is for breast cancer awareness. People aren't wearing ribbons around and having big fundraisers for it. So I hope in raising the awareness with this presentation with you who are interacting with your clients and patients, this will have an impact to help them raise awareness and improve people's health and reduce their risk for fractures, which are deadly and debilitating. And let's just talk about the mortality. I mentioned that, 36% chance of dying, up to 36% chance. That's actually more than the risk for dying from breast cancer when you combine all the different stages of breast cancer together. The greatest risk of dying is within the first 90 days. So if somebody survives that, which hopefully they do, their risk gradually decreases over the next 12 months. Interestingly, the risk of dying in mortality is almost double in males than it is in females. And part of the reason for that thinking is that there may be other comorbidities involved, which increase the risk for dying. Similar with the COVID pandemic, when people had comorbidities like high blood pressure, or asthma, it increased their risk for hospitalization and dying. Similar as people get older with osteoporosis, if they have other diseases present, like diabetes, like cardiovascular disease, their risk for dying increases. And it's thought that in men, the comorbidities as they get older are more severe than in women. And the speculation is that that's what accounts for this difference in the risk for dying. In terms of osteoporosis, though, it is primarily a disease that affects women. 80% of cases are in women, and that's mostly probably what you're going to see. As I mentioned before, about 50% of people who survive the first year of a fracture never return to full function. And in fact, 20% of them required nursing home care in this study. Those who survive a hip fracture after 1 year, 27% did not actually even regain their independent mobility. They were still walking with a walker or needed assistance to move around. And 30% of those survivors didn't recover their pre-fracture level for basic activities of daily living, brushing their teeth, showering, caring for themselves. So the gold standard of bone density testing is the bone density test or screen DEXA scan dual X-ray absorptiometry test. It's a type of X-ray. The X-rays go into the bone. It bounces off the minerals in the bone. And the machine does some calculations and it spits out a result called a T-score. Actually, two results, a T-score and Z-score. The question, though, is how well does a bone density test predict fractures? And that's sort of the bottom line with this entire approach or emphasis. If you're teaching clients or if you're thinking about this with yourself, there's a very simple question that should always be asked when it comes to osteoporosis. How well does a test predict fractures? And if you're being recommended something, whether it's diet, lifestyle, nutritional, dietary supplements, how well or has it been shown to reduce fractures? And it's the same with medications. So what we know with a bone density test is it predicts less than half of women who will get a fracture. We've known that since the 1990s. And a 2008 article came out that determined that a bone density test only predicts 44% of elderly women, by definitions, that's 65 years or older, with osteoporosis who will break a bone. And it's even less predictive for men, only 21% of men. In fact, in 2014, in Annals of Internal Medicine, a study came out that concluded among persons receiving FDA approved medications, so people taking medications for osteoporosis, the changes in bone density are not even a good predictor of the ability of the medication to reduce fractures. Now, there's a chapter on medications in my book, but what I want to just mention briefly about them is that medications, in terms of preventing fractures, don't prevent fractures equally at all sites, because a vertebrae, the pressures on the vertebrae are different than the pressures on the hip as people move around, and the forces are different. And so what we find is that for primary fracture prevention, that is, if somebody's never broken a bone before with osteoporosis, the most common osteoporosis medications, the oral bisphosphonates, for example, have never been shown to prevent both a vertebral fracture and a hip fracture, not both, only vertebral fractures. Whereas the majority of fractures that occur are non-vertebral fractures, and those are the most deadly. The hip fractures are the most deadly. And yet those medications don't prevent a primary hip fracture. There's only one medication that's been shown to be effective for the primary prevention of both vertebral and hip fractures, and that's intravenous Zometa, also a bisphosphonate, but it's intravenous. So that's in my book as well. So let's talk about dietary solutions and what can be done. The Mediterranean diet has been studied for, my goodness, over 50, 60 years, repeatedly been shown to be the healthiest dietary pattern in all the studies that I've ever looked at or seen, associated with reduced risk for not just cardiovascular disease and diabetes and dementia and Parkinson's disease, but also osteoporosis and fractures. So in this study, women with a higher adherence to the Mediterranean diet had the lowest risk of fractures, as measured by FRAX. So FRAX is a free online tool that measures the 10-year estimates that the risk of getting a fracture, an osteoporosis fracture, in the next 10 years. You can just search FRAX. It is a tool that asks people to put in their age, certain medications they may be taking, and there's a little bit of their medical history, their bone density test if they have it, and it gives them a prediction of what their risk is for a fracture over the next 10 years. There are some limitations with that approach. I do like to use that because it's a way to raise and start the conversation about what people can do and get people interested in their bones. But there are questions that aren't asked. Like, they don't ask about antidepressant medications, the Prozac type medications, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and the serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. Those are the SSRI and the SNRI medications. Both of those, we know now, there have been quite a few studies on it, destroy bone, create osteoporosis, and increase fracture risk. It also doesn't ask about acid blocking medications, which are very common medications. We now know that those also destroy bone and increase osteoporosis and fracture risk. So there are some limitations to that approach. Predictive factors in this dietary pattern in this study were legumes, some wine. Risk factors were, butter and meats, fish and olive oil also were protective. Now, this confirms previous studies, not the first one. A meta-analysis, this showed that the higher adherence is associated with the Mediterranean diet is associated with a 21% decreased hip fracture risk and higher bone mineral density in the lumbar spine, whole body, and trochanter, so in the femur, in the hip area. It also tended higher Mediterranean diet adherence tended to be associated with healthier lifestyle, so greater physical activity and fewer toxic habits. And we've actually find this, studies find this, that if somebody's eating healthier, they're probably also doing other positive things for their health in terms of perhaps exercising, perhaps getting more sleep. But the same is if they focus on any other domain of their health. Let's say they're exercising. If they're exercising, they're more likely to start eating healthier as well. Other studies with looking at dietary patterns showed 6% fewer hip fractures related to the higher adherence to the Mediterranean diet. And those were positively and dose dependently associated with bone mineral density. So basically the bottom line is the more somebody adheres to that Mediterranean dietary pattern, the healthier it is for their bones. Now, what about vegans and vegetarians? Research has looked at this, and the meta-analysis was done in 2021. Over almost 14,000 volunteers were evaluated in terms of the data from those studies. And what it showed is that vegans and vegetarians had lower bone mineral density than people who ate omnivore diets. Why is that? It may be because they're not getting enough protein intake, which is lower in vegetarians and vegans compared to omnivores, because not all of the vegan and vegetarian studies were negative. Not all of them showed individually that those dietary patterns increase the risk for low bone density and osteoporosis. And the authors of this meta-analysis speculated that perhaps in the studies that did not show a decrease in bone density, it may be because in those studies the volunteers were eating more protein. So let's look at protein. Collagen is the main protein in bone, type 1 collagen. That's what actually gives bone its flexibility and its ultimate strength. But in addition to collagen, there are 180 to 200 different proteins in bone. So getting enough protein is important. It cannot be underestimated how important that is. And in fact, when you have the combination of osteoporosis and sarcopenia, which is muscle wasting, the risk of dying in men goes way up. Sarcopenia, that is muscle wasting, is a risk for falls and fall-related injuries, and fractures is one of those fall-related injuries. But what we also find is that when you get a combination of low bone mineral density and low muscle mass, you get an increased risk for fractures in men and an increased risk of mortality. But interestingly, in women, the risk did not increase, and I'm not sure really why. But in terms of consuming enough protein, 38% of adult men and 41% of women eat less than the RDA for protein. And as people get older, that actually goes up. So 15% people over than 60 years old consume less than 75% of the RDA. So they're getting an extremely low protein diet. That percentage of people over 60 who are getting 75%, less than 75% of the RDA. Now, the US RDA for protein for adults is 0.8 to 1.2 grams per kilogram body weight per day. And the research has actually shown that that's even insufficient for gaining muscle and maintaining muscle masses as people age. So how much do you need? I mentioned this. So most older adults, and this is a quote from the study there in the second bullet, who have acute or chronic diseases need even more dietary protein than the US RDA. They need at least 1.2 to 1.45 grams per kilogram body weight per day. If you're not sure how to calculate that, what does that mean in terms of pounds? Just take somebody's body weight in pounds, divide it by 2.2, and multiply it by 1.2, 1.3, 1.5. Now, I like 1.3, 1.4 in terms of grams per kilogram body weight per day as a minimum. And some recommendations go all the way up to 2 grams per kilogram body weight per day. Now, what about walking? It's often stated that you've got to take 10,000 steps a day. Well, fortunately, researchers looked at that statement, that question, that urban myth, and determined that it's really not true. You don't need 10,000 steps a day. You need about 7,000 to 7,500 steps on average a day. That amount of steps is associated with a 50 to 70% decrease in all-cause mortality, which includes dying from fractures. Now, inactivity in people who in the US is at epidemic numbers, I should say. There, 40% of people, over 40% of people 65 and older, aren't doing any regular physical activity. So when people hear I've got to do 10,000 steps a day, it really can be overwhelming. That sounds like a lot. Now, 7,000 to 7,500 may sound a lot to them as well, but it's cumulative. I have, and I don't know if you can see here, but I've got an iWatch. I track my steps every day, and it's cumulative. Park further away at the supermarket to take more steps. You can walk around your house, go for a walk around the block. Things, it doesn't have to be all at once, but getting that 7,000 to 7,500 steps a day has great health benefits. The benefits in terms of reduction of all-cause mortality seem to plateau at about 7,500 steps per day. So getting more than that in terms of all-cause mortality in these studies didn't really seem to have greater benefit. And moderate physical activity is associated with a 45% decrease in hip fracture risk. So really getting people to move is important, and meeting them where they're at. Not everybody wants to go to a gym, and not everybody should go to a gym. It's not safe for everybody. So even if you could just get them walking more, that's going to be helpful. And let's talk about going to a gym, doing certain exercises or not. We don't want to create any harm. Unfortunately, when most people go see their medical provider and they have osteoporosis or maybe osteopenia, which is pre-osteoporosis, they're told, exercise. And they're just sent out there with that recommendation with no parameters, no discussion of what may be safe or not safe. And many people out there who are doing personal training, who are maybe teaching Pilates classes, teaching yoga classes, aren't experts in working with people with osteoporosis. And there's some things, some movements, some activities that actually can increase somebody's fracture risk if they have osteoporosis. Now, there's only one study that's looked at specific exercises and the risk for fractures. It was back in 1984, 59 volunteers with postmenopausal osteoporosis. And they were given 4 different exercises to do. One was back extensions while lying down. If you've ever done heard of the Superman pose, I think that's what it looks like to me. Somebody lying on their stomach with their arms back behind them, flexing backward. Extension in a seated position, sitting on a chair and thrusting their chest forward and arching their back backwards. Stretching the back muscles by bending forward, sitting in a chair and just bending forward with your body weight. And then sit-ups, lying down doing sit-ups. And what they found about 1.5, 2 years later, they followed these women. 16% of women doing the extension exercises had a new spinal fraction, while 89% of them doing flexion exercises and 53% of those doing a combination of flexion and extension had new spinal fractures. So it's really that flexion, doing those sit-ups and bending forward, those really seem to be, at least for me, it was counterintuitive, a challenge. And that may be because those anterior wedge fractures that happen with osteoporosis, the dowager hump that occurs, people are already hunched forward a lot in their daily lives, on computers, on their cell phones and their devices, while driving, while watching TV. And it's just putting more stress on that front part, that anterior portion, segments of the spine. So it seems like extension exercises are going to be the safest to do. And that's why, however, working with somebody who, referring them, partnering, getting contacts in your local community of people who actually understand how to work with people safely with osteoporosis is important. So there's actually a lack of direct evidence of fracture reduction in osteoporosis from randomized controlled trials, and it's very hard to do. One study calculated it would take 7,000 high-risk patients would be needed to conduct a randomized controlled clinical trial on exercise and fractures. So it just hasn't been done. I'm doubtful it will be done. But from results from a meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies where they're prospectively, following people in their lives, is that moderate to vigorous physical activity is associated with about a 45% reduction in hip fracture and 38% or risk reduction 40 and 38% respectively among men and women. So 45% reduction in men, 38% reduction in women. But also making sure muscle strength is there, as I mentioned, is important for reducing fractures, making sure and falls, making sure balance is good. And I like practical solutions. So one of the things I teach is the stork exercise. If you haven't heard it, where people, while they brush their teeth, they stand on one leg. They need to steady themselves by holding the hand on their counter. They can a little bit. It should be 1 minute brushing the bottom teeth, 1 minute brushing the top teeth. So when they finish the bottom teeth, they just switch to the other leg for the second minute. If they're doing that twice a day, they're working a bit of their core muscles, they're working of their quads, their hamstrings a little bit, and they're improving that neurological connection and improving their balance. So again, things are cumulative. It can just be small things they do throughout the day. So there's an exercise and diet consensus statement that's come out of Europe. There is none in the United States when it comes to musculoskeletal health and postmenopausal women. And they are recommending dietary protein intake. And one thing that's different than, I think their dietary protein intake personally is too low. But one thing that's different than what I talked about before in terms of just measuring, total dietary intake throughout the day based on a person's body weight, is that they're recommending 20 to 25 grams of protein with each meal. So that's another way of looking at it. If you don't feel like, the calculation isn't a great for you to do, 20 to 25 grams of protein. And there are lots of protein, handouts and charts out there on the internet. And I've got one in the appendix of my book and on my website, that people can get of, protein content of different foods. But a 3 ounce serving of chicken, 3 ounces of meat is about the size of a deck of cards that can fit in the palm of somebody's hand. That's about 23 grams of protein. So adequate vitamin D intake is important. Adequate calcium intake is important, and physical exercise 3 to 5 times a week with protein intake. So let's talk about nutrients shown to reduce fractures. So there are only 4 nutrients that have been shown in isolation, clinical trials or prospective, cohort studies to reduce osteoporosis or to reduce fractures, maintain strong bones as indicated by fewer fractures in the volunteers. So that's calcium, vitamin D, MK4, and strontium. There's some other nutrients not been shown to reduce fractures. Some of them have some promising research on them. Some of them have no promising research on them, but you'll often encounter them in dietary supplements. So I think it's important to mention them. So let's talk quickly about vitamin D and calcium. So vitamin D alone has not been shown to reduce fractures, and there is some reduction in falls with vitamin D, but in terms of fractures, it needs to be combined with calcium. It's been shown to reduce fractures by about 10 to 23%. The form of calcium used in most of the studies is calcium carbonate. There's no indication that one form of calcium is superior to another form of calcium. One of the challenges with calcium, especially calcium carbonate, is it requires stomach acid to be present. Calcium carbonate is a combination of a calcium atoms and a carbonate, and they have to be broken apart in order for your intestines to absorb the calcium, and that requires stomach acid, a low pH. As people get older, they're more likely to have reduced stomach action production, so that stomach acid goes down and the pH goes up, which makes it more difficult to absorb calcium carbonate. My preferred form of calcium is calcium citrate, because even at a basic pH, when there's low stomach acid, it can still disassociate the citrate from the calcium, and your body can absorb it. In general, it's 24% better absorption than calcium carbonate, and it's even higher when somebody has low stomach acid. So vitamin D, I'm a fan of testing for vitamin D levels. What we know is that for fracture, reducing fractures, the optimal reduction was achieved when the blood vitamin D level was 30 to 44 nanograms per milliliter. So I'm a big fan of doing vitamin D blood testing. People can order a vitamin D blood test now without a doctor's order, done at home. It's just a little finger prick. There are different companies that do it. I'm not affiliated with any of them. And they get a little kit at home. They prick their finger. They drop some blood on some blotter paper, and they send it in, and the lab measures it. So that's an accessible, a good way to do that. That's easy for a lot of people, or at their annual exams when they go see their physician, or if you're able to order it, they can just get that ordered through a conventional lab as well. But ordering it themselves is not expensive. Interestingly, we see an association with improved bone density as low as 9 nanograms per milliliter. But it goes back to that bone density, the limitations of that bone density test. You see bone density going up, 9, 10, 12, 15, 20 nanograms per milliliter, but you don't get the fracture reduction until you get into that 30 to 44 nanogram per milliliter range. Now, there's some clinicians and research out there supporting a higher level of vitamin D, serum vitamin D levels, maybe 50 or 60 for immune system benefits and immune health. But in terms of bone, just talking about bones, that 30 to 44 nanograms per milliliter seems to be the optimal range. Interestingly, despite the research, the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force recommends against routine vitamin D supplementation to prevent falls in the elderly, despite the fact that there is ample research showing that vitamin D supplementation does reduce fall risk. Similar to the fracture risk reduction, the optimal fall prevention was achieved when the mean vitamin D level was about 30 to 44 as well. Calcium safety has gotten a lot of interest from people recently. I'm getting a lot of questions about calcium safety. There's ongoing research. There are conflicting results, but two of the largest studies that were run to date, both, one was a cohort study, one was a clinical trial. The first one there looked at men and women, and it was an AARP diet and health study. About 12 years was the follow-up. Men taking over 1,000 milligrams per day of supplemental calcium compared to no supplemental calcium had an increased risk of total cardiovascular disease death. So for men, they should definitely not be getting over 1,000 milligrams per day of calcium. And I'm a fan of really nobody getting over 1,000 milligrams per day of supplemental calcium for bone health. There's a clinical trial that was a post-intervention study that looked at women. It was the Women's Health Initiative study. The total follow-up was 11.1 years, over 36,000 volunteers. They took 1,000 milligrams per day as calcium carbonate plus vitamin D. And the conclusion was taking supplemental calcium, there's no effect on cardiovascular disease or all-cause mortality. Now, the problem with calcium may not be just the supplement. So dietary supplements, I believe, should be used as the FDA intended. That is, as a supplement to a healthy diet. The National Academy of Medicine position statement is that calcium is safe up to 2,000 to 2,500 milligrams per day from all sources, from diet and dietary supplements. The average American woman gets about 800 milligrams of calcium per day in her diet. The US RDA for calcium for adults is 1,200 to 1,500 milligrams per day. And the United States Institutes of Medicine position on calcium and bone health is that there is no improved benefit, there's no more benefit for bones to getting over 1,200 milligrams per day. Because the average woman gets about 800 milligrams per day as calcium from her diet, and hopefully they're working with you, their diet is better than the average American woman. A dietary supplement with about 400 milligrams of calcium in it will be sufficient to get her within that 1,200 to 1,500 milligrams per day range without the risk of exceeding the safe level of 2,000 to 2,000 milligrams per day total. So let's talk about vitamin K. Vitamin K is also very popular in bone health and bone support supplements. Osteocalcin is a protein produced in bone. Vitamin K is involved with the metabolism and the creation of osteocalcin, and people test osteocalcin to as a way to predict fractures, and they tell their patients, oh, well, here, look, your osteocalcin is in the healthy range now, and so I gave you vitamin K, and so you're good to go. But the question is, it's a test. How well does that predict fractures? And even with that, there's conflicting evidence, but even with that, vitamin K is a category of molecules. So there's vitamin K1 or phytoquinone found in green leafy vegetables. Then there's vitamin K2, which is a subcategory, which itself contains different types of vitamin K2 molecules designated by numbers at the end of them. The two that you'll find in dietary supplements are MK4 and MK7. The numbers reflect how many carbons or how long the side chain of that vitamin K molecule is. Now, we know in biochemistry that if you change one carbon atom, if you change one side chain on a molecule, it can confer or create different physiological and biochemical activities and results. Now, there's an overlap, all types of, in terms of their effects, like a Venn diagram, but all the effects are not the same. They're not the same molecules. They don't have the exact same activity. Now, all forms of vitamin K have been shown to reduce fractures in clinical trials. I'm sorry, not fractures, to reduce osteocalcin in clinical trials. In terms of maintaining strong bones, as indicated by reducing fractures, only one form of vitamin K2 has been shown to do that, and that's MK4 in the form of 45, in the amount of 45 milligrams per day. MK7 has never been shown in any clinical trials to reduce or to maintain strong bones as indicated by a reduction in fractures in volunteers. In fact, MK4 also is the only form of vitamin K2 that's been shown to consistently improve bone density. The clinical trials on MK7 have been shown to perhaps slow the loss of bone mineral density, but not actually reverse them in every clinical trial that I've seen looking at MK7. When you also look at clinical trials of MK4 and MK7, you look at, if you search for MK4, bone mineral density on PubMed, what you'll find is 4 or 5 or so clinical trials on MK7, and there are over 25 clinical trials on MK4. So it's the more studied form. It's been shown to have the greater benefits. And that's why really just focusing on this marker on a test, the results on a test, again, is a limited way of thinking and is not doing your clients or patients the best possible service for them. I'm going to skip over this a little bit. So here's the cautionary tale with osteocalcin. First of all, it's not just a protein in bone. It's been shown to have hormonal effects. It does have some bone specific effects where it facilitates bindings of hydroxyapatite in the bone matrix, but it also affects the insulin secretion in the pancreas. And it binds to Leydig cells in the testes and increases testosterone synthesis, and it crosses the blood-brain barrier and has central nervous system approaches. So there's systemic effects of some proteins like osteocalcin produced in the bone. And in terms of a causal effect, in terms of osteocalcin and the test and looking at its ability to predict fractures, there are no, first of all, clinical trials just looking at osteocalcin and fractures. The best we have are animal studies. And the 2 animal studies that have been done were both negative, meaning that the mice that actually didn't have osteocalcin had stronger bones than the mice that did have the normal wild type mice that did have the osteocalcin. And in fact, a 2012 review of the research concluded that it's a relative measure of vitamin K status in bone, but not a biomarker of bone health. And caution should be taken in the interpretation of the relative changes in percent under carboxylated osteocalcin. It's the amount of osteocalcin that needs more carboxyl groups put on it, which is what vitamin K does, when discussing the role of vitamin K in bone health. So vitamin K and fractures, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is the most important thing to look at. Does something that you're recommending, has it been shown to maintain strong bones as indicated by fewer fractures? Now, MK4, MK7, these nutrients, they're not medications. They're nutrients and dietary supplements. They've not been approved by the FDA to diagnose, treat, prevent, or cure any disease. But what does the research show in terms of its ability to maintain bone health and promote bone health? Well, the Japanese Ministry of Health looked at this issue, and MK4, 45 milligrams per day, has been approved since 1995 for bone health. And in fact, their 2011 guidelines state that metatetraone, which is another name for MK4, is considered to exert its anti-fracture or fracture-reducing effect via mechanism action other than increasing bone mineral density. Again, it goes back to that story. Bone mineral density is not the whole picture here. MK4, like all nutrients that we ingest, has many activities, many roles in the biochemistry, many actions in the body. Promoting healthy bone density is just one, but it also promotes healthy collagen production. It's been shown to modulate inflammatory molecule like NF-kappa beta production and many other benefits as well. In fact, vitamin K, the vitamin K that accumulates in the body, is predominantly the MK4. MK7 is produced by bacteria. It's not produced in our bodies. Our bodies can actually convert MK4 from vitamin K1 and MK7, and the form that accumulates in tissues throughout the body, in the breasts and the testes and the intestines and the pancreas, et cetera, is in that MK4 form, suggesting that the health benefits of MK4 are much more profound and wide-ranging than just having benefits on bones. A little caveat here about the literature. There's lots of confusion, the last bullet points there in the literature about vitamin K. I see this all the time, and it's a frustration of mine, similar to vitamin E, which is a category. With vitamin K, the researchers will lump all the forms together and say vitamin K does this or does that, or this is what the research show, without defining which form of vitamin K they're actually talking about. When I've reached out to researchers and emailed them and asked them which form they're talking about, they'll tell me they're using a form in a clinical trial, not multiple forms. And when they're looking and pooling the research, even in one meta-analysis that I believe I'll review in here, if not, I'll mention it, they pulled all the forms together of vitamin K, of vitamin K2, and they said that the data show that vitamin K2 does not affect fractures, does not have an anti-fracture effect. But then they even say in their conclusion, well, we pooled all the data together, and so our study cannot give any indication as to whether one specific form of vitamin K2 does have those benefits or has those effects. So it's important that the details are important. There have been lots of clinical trials, as I mentioned, on MK4 and people with anorexia nervosa, cirrhosis of the liver, bone loss due to medications like glucocorticoids, prednisone, dexamethasone, disuse from stroke, another medication, leuprolide, osteoporosis caused by menopause, etc. So here's that meta-analysis I was talking about that just pooled them all together, 36 randomized controlled trial. And they even said, at the very last bullet, bolded there, our results cannot be confirmatory with regard to the relative effectiveness of different vitamin K regimes. And what's challenging is the North American Menopause Society recently updated their recommendations for osteoporosis, and they actually have a paragraph or a couple of paragraphs, a small section on vitamin K. And they cite this study as a reason why taking vitamin K for bone health is not supported. So they're even taking the research out of context, which is unfortunate because they're seen as an authority in this space of women's health, and they're providing clinical guidelines for osteoporosis. And it's sad for me to see that, because there have been other clinical trials that I'll talk about MK4. But here's one about diet. It's important to look at diet as well. So dietary vitamin K1, we do know that the more vitamin K1 somebody consumes in their diet, vitamin K1 is found in green leafy vegetables, the better the outcomes when it comes to bone health. So this was five different studies. The data were pooled, almost 81,000 volunteers, and they used frequency questionnaires primarily, which has some limitations, but it is one of the better methodologies. And what they found was an inverse association between dietary vitamin K1 intake and risk for fractures. So that means a 22% reduction in the risk for fractures in people in taking the highest amount of the highest quartile of vitamin K1 in their diet, consuming it, compared to the lowest quartile. For each increase in 50 micrograms per day of dietary vitamin K1, there was an associated with a 3% reduction in relative risk for fractures. MK4 meta-analysis. So there have been two other meta-analyses done that looked just at MK4. One was in 2006, one more recently. This first one that was done looked at 13 randomized controlled trials, and it concluded that MK4, in fact, does maintain strong bones and can reduce the risk for, as indicated by reduced risk for fractures. Now, there was a problem with that study in that after it was published, three of the studies were retracted after they had been published and after they were used in this analysis. And so there's another citation out there on PubMed that talks about, they're making sure you interpret this initial meta-analysis data and conclusions with caution. But fortunately for us, the original study, the 2006 meta-analysis, already evaluated all of the data and omitted those three studies in a subset of the data that it evaluated. So in table 3 of that 2006 publication is the data analysis excluding those three problematic trials, right? So even when those studies had been excluded, what they found is that MK4, 45 milligrams per day, reduced the risk for vertebral fractures by 60% and all non-vertebral fractures by 76%. A 2015 meta-analysis similarly concluded benefit when it comes to maintaining strong bones and reducing fractures. When they removed heterogeneity from the study, they found a overall 53% reduced risk for fractures. And they concluded that MK4 is effective for maintaining vertebral bone mineral density and forearm bone mineral density in postmenopausal women with osteoporosis and for reducing the overall incidences of fractures. Safety, there's no tolerable upper limit set for natural forms of vitamin K, of which MK4 is one. In terms of it, I hear sometimes, especially conventionally trained practitioners, their patients will come back to me and say, oh, my doctor said taking this amount of vitamin K is going to kill me. It's going to throw a blood clot. That's just not true. They don't understand the research, the safety clinical trials, the amount of data. I mean, there are over 7,000 volunteers in clinical trials that have been followed for years. There have been specific safety studies done. Again, this has been endorsed by the Ministry of Health in Japan since 1995. There have been clinical trials up to 135 milligrams per day of MK4 with no dangerous side effects, no increased blood clots. The safety in rats, in a rat study, 250 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day did not increase the risk for blood clots to form. And that equivalent in humans would be consuming kilograms of MK4 per day. Additionally, when it comes to the risk for blood clots, just conceptually, it's important to understand is that the blood clotting cascade in humans, there are three enzymes that use vitamin K to promote blood clotting. Once those enzymes have enough vitamin K to be working at full speed, just like a conveyor belt going at full speed, they can't go any faster. It can't produce more blood clots any quicker. So those enzymes and those binding sites of the enzymes become what's called saturated. And that's it. It goes on MK4, vitamin K goes on to do other things in the body. A little caution if people do use MK7, and that is it is derived from soy, from natto. And so patients with an intolerance or allergy to soy, it can create problems with it. I've seen that before. Also, anyone taking warfarin, because warfarin works by blocking those vitamin K enzymes to prevent blood clotting and reduce blood clotting. warfarin is an anti-clotting medication. Anybody taking warfarin should not be taking MK4. Because MK7 has a longer half-life, if they need to be taking some vitamin K under the guidance of a clinician who knows what they're doing and can track this, you can get a stable, steady state of vitamin K, MK7, by using the MK7 molecule. But again, that doesn't translate into the bone health results that we're looking for. Let's look at strontium. That's another popular supplement ingredient. Strontium is approved in some European countries in the form of what's called strontium ranelate for osteoporosis. It's been shown in vitro to decrease osteoclast activity. Those are the cells that break bone down, and increase osteoblast activity, the cells that build more bone. And the challenge with strontium, and there are a few caveats with strontium, and this is why I don't like using it, is that it's a mineral, so it incorporates into bone. The X-ray, the bone density test, when it shoots the X-ray into the bone, it bounces off the mineral. So it's bouncing off the strontium as well. Because strontium is heavier than calcium, it changes how that X-ray bounces off and is detected by the machine. The machines in the US, because it's not approved as a medication, can't accommodate for the strontium. And so what happens is you get a false bone density test result. So the bone density test result is not going to be accurate when people are taking strontium. Now, despite the limitations of bone density tests, I do believe they're important to get and to track the results of them, and they should be accurate. There's some increased safety risks that need to be understood with strontium, at least strontium ranelate. Strontium ranelate safety has been called into question. A 2014 study came out that looked at regulatory data and clinical trial publications for strontium and determined that strontium ranelate increases the risk for dangerous blood clots like venous thromboembolism, pulmonary thromboemboli, and heart attacks, things that can cause, blood clots that can cause heart attacks and strokes. So much so that the number of fractures prevented by strontium use is similar to the number of extra cases of getting a venous thromboembolus, which is like a deep vein thrombosis, a blood clot in the back of your knee, or a blood clot in your lungs, a pulmonary embolism that can kill you, or heart attack, a myocardial infarction caused by strontium. In the US, the dietary supplement strontium ingredient is typically a strontium citrate, and there are no safety studies on strontium citrate, and there are no clinical trials on strontium citrate and its effects on bone density or maintaining strong bones, as indicated by looking at fractures. Now, in terms of fractures, strontium ranelate has been shown to reduce fractures. Of the 6 large clinical trials that have been published, 5 of the 6 only showed benefit with reducing vertebral fractures, not hip fractures. So you're looking at a relative risk of, one study, the top one there, and I bolded the most important information, 29% reduction in vertebral fracture risk at, 500 milligrams per day. No significant, at a higher dose in another study, 2 grams per day, no significant difference in fracture risk by taking it. Another 2 gram per day study, 33% reduction in vertebral fracture risk. Clinical trial number 4, no difference in hip fracture risk in the strontium group. Vertebral fractures reduced by about 35%, taking 2 grams per day. Another 2 gram per day study, clinical trial 5, 36% reduction in hip fracture risk. And that's the only study that actually showed a reduction in hip fractures. The rest all showed no non-vertebral, no hip fracture reduction, only vertebral fracture reduction. Let's look at collagen, because that's very popular as a dietary supplement right now. Collagen is one of the most abundant proteins in the body. It's very rich in bones. The collagen in bone is is type 1 collagen. It's the most abundant type of collagen in the bone. It makes up 90% of bone collagen is that type 1 collagen. A review of 60 studies of collagen peptides found that they promote healthy tissue regeneration. Collagen synthesis supports healthy joints, bone density, and skin. In one study with rats, that's the only that's the closest we have. There is no human clinical trial looking at fractures. Femoral fractures healed significantly faster when the animals were fed hydrolyzed collagen. There is one study looking at a marker of collagen breakdown. It's called CTX or cetalopeptide. When collagen breaks down in the bone, it's a specific marker for bone collagen. CTX in the blood and urine increases, right? So there was a clinical trial looking at CTX and different variables and relating that to fracture risk, overall fracture risk. So what they saw was in the second column there, the CTX, the highest quartile, depending, it didn't matter if it was tested in the serum or the urine, you see an increased risk for fractures. And when somebody also had a lower estradiol or E2, that increased the predictive value for the risk for fractures. And when somebody had a low bone mineral density, lower than minus 2.5, and their urinary CTX was in the highest quartile, the relative risk for fracture was even higher. It had even a greater predictive value. Now, there are lots of tests out there looking at bone health and what should be run. Osteocalcin is not recommended by any laboratory or medical organization. The CTX, however, is recommended by it's a long designation, International Clinical Laboratory Association. I forget exactly what it is, but they recommend that test. So that is a test that can have some predictive value. There was a clinical trial then that looked at postmenopausal women with osteopenia, not osteoporosis, but pre-osteoporosis, osteopenia, which is defined as a T-score of between -1 and -2.5. That lasted 3 months. So taking 5 grams of collagen per day, plus calcium and vitamin D. They compared that to a control group that only took calcium and vitamin D. And what they found is the women taking the collagen plus the other nutrients had their CTX decreased by 11.4%, which is good. The higher CTX, the worse it is. You want your CTX to be lower. People interestingly taking vitamin D and calcium, the women did have a decrease in CTX of 3.5%, but when the collagen was added, the supportive collagen was added onto, you get an even greater benefit, similar to when you have MK4, calcium and vitamin D by itself, and then you add the MK4 onto it, you get even greater benefit. Oh, so here's talking about the International, that big name of that laboratory group. So the International Federation of Clinical Chemistry and Laboratory Medicine and the International Osteoporosis Foundation both recommend serum CTX as a resorption reference marker for use in fracture risk prediction and osteoporosis treatment monitoring. So the benefit of bone turnover markers like CTX over a bone density test is that you can test the CTX marker more frequently. A bone density test, you can only test about every 18 to 24 months, but because the bone density tends to change slower, and the sensitivity of the DEXA test, it's not sensitive enough to pick up changes much earlier than that. And the CTX, though, that will change faster, so you can test that more frequently. So let's look at magnesium, another popular bone health dietary supplement nutrient. There have been studies showing a significantly lower concentration of serum magnesium in osteoporotic women compared to controls. And intracellular magnesium was correlated with bone mineral density, meaning the higher the amount, the greater the amount of magnesium inside the cells. They were probably intracellular, typically means they were testing red blood cells. Intracellular magnesium was correlated with better bone mineral density. The bottom line is that low magnesium or hypomagnesemia is associated with lower bone mineral density. But what about fracture risk? So there's a prospective cohort study, and what they found is that the lowest quartile of serum magnesium was associated with increased fracture risk compared to the highest. However, quote, there was no evidence of an association of dietary magnesium intake with risk of any fracture. Meaning, yes, there was the lower the serum magnesium quartile, there was an increased fracture risk, but the opposite was true, meaning the more magnesium they calculated that people were taking didn't necessarily reduce their fracture risk. So that study and the conclusions are, really raise some questions for me about, what's really going on here. Diet and lifestyle, there's so many independent variables going on. It's really challenging in diet research to narrow it down to one individual nutrient. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan of magnesium. Most people don't get enough magnesium from diet, but I'm looking and I'm supplementing with magnesium in general for a lot of people. I'm a fan of that. Magnesium is used for over 300 different biochemical reactions in the body. But when we're talking about just a bone support and bone health dietary supplement, should magnesium be in it? Has the research concluded and shown that it actually maintains strong bones as indicated by reducing fractures, which is my personal criteria. Now, I think it should be in a good multivitamin and mineral supplement. You may want to supplement it, separately. But what does the research show? So Women's Health Initiative data, almost 74,000 postmenopausal women with osteoporosis. And their conclusion was magnesium intake had no effect on fracture risk. There have been no prospective controlled clinical trials showing that magnesium, in fact, reduces fractures. And to get that incredible, over 70% reduction in fractures with MK4, magnesium was not used in any of the clinical trials. It was calcium, vitamin D, and that was it and MK4. One more thing about magnesium. There is one study dating back to the 1990s that I don't have in here that looked at magnesium as magnesium oxide, the least absorbable form of magnesium, and looking at its effect on bone density. That did show an improvement in bone density, but it was underpowered to detect fractures, meaning they didn't look at fractures. All right, melatonin. So yes, there are melatonin receptors in bone. In fact, the vast majority of melatonin is not produced in the brain, which is, I think, where most people think it's produced, or most of it is produced, because it's of a benefits and effect with circadian rhythm and helping people sleep. But most of the melatonin is produced in the periphery, and there are melatonin receptors in the bone. And by the periphery, I mean in the gut, melatonin produced in the gut. Those melatonin then combine to cells in the bone and help promote more bone formation. There's one randomized clinical trial of 81 postmenopausal women with osteopenia. It lasted a year. They tried 2 different doses, 1 and 3 milligrams of melatonin. And what they showed is that there was an increase in bone density at both the 1 and 3 milligrams per day in the femoral neck and in the spine. The spine increase was only was 3.6%, and that was with 3 milligrams per day, not at the 1 milligram per day. But it did not significantly affect bone mineral density at any other sites. So in terms of the spine, the femoral neck, and then other sites that they tested. So femoral neck in the femur, it increased bone density by 1.4% in a dose-dependent manner, meaning the more the melatonin, the 3 milligrams was better than the 1 milligram. And in fact, 2.3% it increased by 2.3% in the 3 milligram per day dose. 24-hour urinary calcium was also decreased 12.2% with melatonin. That's the only clinical trial to date. No fracture outcome studies, though, however. But there is an association with reduced sleep and poor quality sleep, not getting enough sleep, insomnia, and osteoporosis and fracture risk. So that may be part of this melatonin study story that's beginning to emerge. Boron. It's a trace mineral. In 1985, it was discovered that humans required some boron, very tiny amounts. No studies have ever shown boron improves bone mineral density, decreases bone loss, or decreases fractures. Oftentimes, multivitamin and mineral supplements contain the nutrient anyway, but for building stronger bones and reducing fractures, it's just there's no clinical trial supporting its use in a bone support dietary supplement. None whatsoever. And I get the boron question a lot. Why isn't there boron? Why isn't there boron? Well, there are no studies on it. What one study did show is you had an increased urinary calcium excretion when someone did not take boron, but only if they were also low in magnesium, right? So if you're giving them magnesium, if they're eating a healthy diet with enough magnesium, they probably don't need extra boron. And even when it comes to bone health dietary supplements, there is zero study showing that it actually has any beneficial effects on bone. Soy isoflavones, it's found in lots of different foods. It's a phytoestrogen. And since estrogen supplementation is approved by the FDA for osteoporosis, soy isoflavones gained attention, and they've been studied for bone building effects. So there are observational studies and clinical trials. They have not shown any consistent evidence that soy isoflavones build stronger bones. These are the products from my company. The OsteoK and the OsteoK Minis products there, as you can see, those have the MK4 45 milligrams per day with calcium and vitamin D. I started my company in 2006 out of my medical practice when I could not find the combination and dose of nutrients used in clinical trials and shown to work that I needed to help my patients. And so I needed those solutions. So I created them and have just continued to research and formulate, for example, Brain Blend, promote healthy mood, focus, recall, energy, all the clinical trial doses of the nutrients all cross the blood-brain barrier. Ferrosolve, because so many women were complaining about cramping and constipation and bloating with iron supplements. I created one that doesn't cause any of that. It's the highest dose ferrous bisglycinate on the market, 45 milligrams per day. And to look at quality, look at the citations. This is my recommendation. Look at the studies supporting the formulas, but also look at the guarantees. What guarantees are the companies putting behind their products? And if you look at my website, you look at my company, who our distributors are, that they vetted us, Full Script, Emerson, Dr. Supplement Store. We also do wholesale accounts directly through my website with quantity discounts for practitioners and sales throughout the year. But we have some unique guarantees as well, because I am so convinced by the quality of the research and the data supporting these formulations. I'm willing to do that because the products give the results guaranteed. And here are some of those unmatched product guarantees. If you look on our website, on the product pages, you can click through for the more details of those guarantees. You can pick up your phone now and go ahead and just scan this QR code. That'll take you directly to the wholesale account, where you can look at our requirements for wholesale accounts, and you can fill out a wholesale account form to apply for one. We will drop ship to clients anywhere in North America. In the United States, there's no minimum order for free shipping, no drop ship fees. And again, we have quantity discounts. You can use a coupon code NBI10 for a discount off your first order. And then we do run additional sales. So make sure to sign up for the newsletter to get not only those announcements and new product announcements, but blogs and research that I'm continuing to do. There's going to be a blog coming out soon on looking at the difference between MK4 and MK7. By the time you're hearing this, it may already be up on the website, so you can go search for that as well. Here's my contact information. Please stay in touch. Send me an email, reach out to me through social media or through my website. I'd be happy to provide any information, have a clinical consult, or answer questions that anybody may have. So thank you so much for spending this time with me and allowing me to share what I've learned and what I'm passionate about to try and tackle this epidemic of weak bones that is killing so many people or leaving them in debilitating pain for the latter years of their life.
John, thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. Really excellent. Thank you for going through that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for going through that research on K2. I know our members are going to find that particularly valuable, and also just dispelling that myth on the 10,000 steps. I know I, for one, feel a little bit better having been locked up in a hotel for the last week and so on and so forth. Of course, we do other movement and things, but I think people get a little hung up and, like you say, overwhelmed on that prospect. But thank you, backed by popular demand, that really was fantastic. So I am going to wrap this up just by reminding everybody that this presentation can be viewed in the NANP's members area, along with a vast selection of cutting-edge webinars. As mentioned, each webinar includes a corresponding quiz, which is worth 1 continuing education credit. So if you have an interesting topic that you would like to present, or if you know any speakers that you would like us to host, then please feel free to reach out to me by emailing me at andrea@nanp.org. So this brings us to the end of our discussion. Thank you for listening. And John, once again, thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, bye for now.
Bye.